Alegerile pentru viitorul președinte al Statelor Unite sunt cu siguranță evenimentul electoral cel mai urmărit în acest an. Toată planeta știe cine sunt candidații pentru cea mai puternică funcție din lume, dar sunt puțini cei care înțeleg cu adevărat sofisticatul sistem de vot al americanilor. De ce sistemul politic din SUA este făcut de fapt să nu funcționeze, să fie imperfect? Ne ajută să înțelegem Edward Rhodes, profesor de politici publice la Universitatea George Mason. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport diplomatic. Dr. Edward Rhodes, Professor of Public Policy for George Mason University, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, we are talking today about the US election. Everyone will be looking at US elections because US elections are important for everyone. But very few people understand how the American voting system is actually working. Why is it so complicated?
It's so complicated because the American political system, set up way back in 1787, was not designed to make policy making easy or to make it quick or even to find good policies. It was really designed because Americans wanted to establish a government that simply focused on protecting individual rights. And so the government was designed to be inefficient, and it was designed to have internal conflict. Americans assumed that if different parts of the government were in conflict with each other, it would make it difficult for the government to become too powerful and too overbearing and to take rights away from the individual. And so the natural state of the American government is gridlock. The natural state of the American political system is not getting anything accomplished, which is frustrating for Americans, but it's even more frustrating for everyone else in the world. And the American election system is designed in a complicated way to make sure that the different parts of the American government don't trust each other and don't get along with each other.
But if you don't get along with each other as parts of government, how you can get things done? Because America is the superpower of the world, so something does work.
But again, the starting place for American government was, as Thomas Jefferson once said, that government is best that governs the least. So the American political system is designed to pass fewer laws and pursue fewer policies, and again, to act more slowly. And again, this was not designed with the assumption that America would be a superpower. It really was designed for a smaller country 250 years ago. We still have the same policy-making system, but again, that creates frustrations when America deals with the world. And I can only apologize. I know how frustrating it is for everyone else in the world to watch the two houses, legislatures we have, the House and Senate, never agreeing on anything. And on those rare occasions when they do agree with each other, then the president refused to sign the law that they've passed. And if all that happens, then for the American Supreme Court to step in and say, law is no good, and to strike that law down. But that's, again, the assumption here is fewer laws are better than more laws. And so we have this system that really is designed to prevent anything from happening.
Another thing that is very hard to understand looking from outside, but even for Americans, is why in the United States there are only two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, and why, for instance, this time for this election, only Joe Biden and Donald Trump can run for the president.
Right. The reason we have two parties most of the time in America and why it's so difficult to have a third party is because all American elections are a majority wins. There's no proportional representation. So if you're a third party, you have no chance of winning. So supporters, potential supporters for a third party, find themselves turning to whichever of the two largest parties seems to best represent their views. And so the way to think of the two American parties is that they're actually coalitions of many, many smaller interest groups. What would be separate parties in most countries actually combine together one or the other of the two major parties. So, for example, in this presidential election, it's like there will be a third candidate. Mr. Kennedy is also going to be running, but it will be very difficult for him to be anything except a spoiler, anything except a protest vote for those Americans who find that neither of the two major parties comes close enough to representing what they want in order to win their support. But he has no chance of actually winning because, again, most Americans simply look to see which party is closer to what they want.
I know it's rather a technicality, but can you also explain why somebody like a third candidate cannot have, for the moment at least, the name on the ballot for being voted?
Yes. Again, one of the things in the design of the American political system set up to prevent government from becoming too powerful is that America's 50 states have enormous power. Each of the American 50 states operates entirely independently of the federal government. It's not that the 50 states are somehow subordinate to the government, nor is it that the federal government is somehow created by the 50 states. In America, every individual has two governments at the same time passing entirely different sets of law that he has to obey. And the way we handle our federal presidential elections is that each of the 50 states gets to decide on the rules and on who will be on the ballot. On the same day, each of the 50 states holds a separate election, holds its own election, to see who that state will support for the President of the United States. So it's an indirect election for the President, and each of the 50 states sets the rules for who can be on the ballot that the people in that state can consider for President. And so someone like Mr. Kennedy, to qualify not just once to be on the ballot, but separately in each of the 50 states, he has to meet the rules of that to appear on that state's ballot so that the people of that state have the option to vote for him for government. So it is a complicated technical procedure, and you're absolutely right. This technicality also made it harder for third-party candidates to get on the ballot. We expect that Mr. Kennedy will be on the ballot in either every state or virtually every state by the time November comes around. But it's simply being on the ballot, again, simply puts him in the position to take more votes away from one of the major candidates or the other major candidate, and so possibly skew the election outcomes that way, rather than being a viable candidate himself.
The American voting system has something that is called popular vote, and in the same time you have the Electoral College, and sometimes the Electoral College actually does get to elect the president. How is this democratic?
Yes, well, when we created the United States, for that we had independent sovereign states, and when we created a single federal government to exist in parallel with the sovereign states which were not eliminated, the Constitution that creates that federal government was concerned about the president not representing the desires of the country as a whole. It was concerned that maybe the people in a few of the bigger states might be able to dominate the vote for president. And so the way the Constitution set it up is that president is not selected by a direct vote of the American people. Instead, in each of the 50 states, the people go to the polls, and in that particular state, the popular vote decides who that state's votes will go for. And so a majority, even a slim majority in a state, will mean that all of that state's votes, all of that state's support in this indirect election will go for one candidate or the other. So you can have a situation like the one in 2016 when Mr. Trump was elected president, where there were more Americans overall who favored his opponent, Mrs. Clinton, but because Mr. Trump was able to put together a slim majority in more states representing more electoral votes than Mrs. Clinton was, under our Constitution, it was Mr. Trump who was selected as president. So you're absolutely right. This is not democratic in the notion of every American having an equal voice in selecting the president. It's designed to make sure that Americans in their states equal voice, and then in this weighted voting by the states then will decide who becomes president. It is a complicated system, and believe me, most Americans do not understand how it works themselves. Most Americans assume that when they vote for president, it is a direct vote, but instead it is this indirect vote where you're voting to have your state's representatives go to the Electoral College, as we call it, and your state's representatives vote for one candidate or another candidate. And again, this approach makes it even more certain that a third-party candidate will find it very difficult to be elected.
And can this system be changed?
It could be changed, but it won't be changed. It would require a constitutional amendment in order to change this system. And every time we have a situation like the one in 2016, where the individual who got the majority vote of the people is not the person who selected as president, Americans temporarily become outraged. But again, the difficulties of changing the Constitution mean that it's unlikely that we will actually change this, at least in your lifetime or mine, that we will proceed with this strange system designed to meet very different circumstances that existed way back in 1787. This system is likely to continue.
In the election night, so on 5th of November this year, when the polls are closed in the states, will United States citizens and the rest of the world already find out who is going to be the next president, or we have to wait a period because, again, it's a complicated system for counting those votes?
I think it's actually unlikely that we will have definite answers on election night. For president, if there is a strong swing, those undecided voters in those key states between now and November, it's possible. It's possible that there is such a sweep that it'll be clear that Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump will be the next president, which isn't to say that Mr. Trump would necessarily acknowledge that he'd lost. Mr. Biden, if Biden loses, it's more likely that he will acknowledge that fact. But Mr. Trump has a tendency to refuse to accept obvious even when there has been a decisive vote against him. So it's possible that even if Mr. Trump loses decisively, he won't admit that on election night. It is quite possible, again, given that this will come down to a small handful of states, probably 3 or 4 states on election night, and those states may be very close. We may not know on election night. It may be so close that people are counting absentee ballots, and ballots were voted by people who couldn't go themselves to the polls to vote it, or that it will be so close that they will be demanding recounts and they will be checking counting ballots that were originally electronically counted. Similarly, in terms of the House and the Senate, if there is a sweep, if one party is clearly more popular than the other, we'll know election night. But again, if you were looking at it today, it's so close in so many of the key, hard-to-call districts. I would think it may be a little while, a few days at least, before we know which party has control of us and which party has control of the Senate.
In Europe, in particular, there is this very much interest for the declaration made by one of the candidates, as you already said. Let's call them unusual when it comes to foreign policy, at least. How much could a president with less usual ideas actually have things done?
Right. And this varies enormously depending on what the specific issue is. For example, entering into a treaty requires a supermajority in the Senate as well as presidential action. To change the size of the military, again, requires both the House and the Senate to agree to that as well as presidential action. There are some the president can do unilaterally. If the United States were attacked or if U.S. forces were attacked, the president could respond without waiting for the House and the Senate to support him. On many issues, it is not entirely clear what the president can or cannot do without congressional support. And so, for example, when the United States has become past involved, say, in military operations in Iraq or in Afghanistan, the president has usually announced that he could do this simply on his own authority. But just to be sure, he's asking for congressional support as well. And so there are a large number of issues. Under the U.S. Constitution, it's not entirely clear. And again, this may sound strange. You may say, well, obviously the Constitution should make it exactly clear what the president can and cannot do. But the people who wrote the Constitution of the United States said, no, we want to make it unclear because we want there to be a constant tension between the House and the Senate and the president. We want them constantly to be fighting. We want them constantly to be struggling over control. That will limit what they can do and limit the chances that they will do anything that might reduce the freedom or liberties of the American people. I understand. For a superpower, this doesn't make much sense. But again, you have to understand that this was designed in imagining a country that was going to be largely separated from the world, whose issues were mostly domestic, and whose concern was not letting the government become too powerful.
With this system and with these complicated issues of the system, can ever United States be turned into a dictatorship?
Never is a big word, and so I won't say never. And it is something that many Americans are deeply concerned about. For those Americans who oppose Donald Trump, one of the big concerns, one of the major concerns, perhaps the most important concern that they have is that Mr. Trump does not seem to value the U.S. Constitution very much, that Mr. Trump sees the role of the president, or at least himself while he's president, as being more dictatorial, you might want to say. And so Americans are concerned, some Americans are very concerned that electing Mr. Trump would be a vote that's taking a step towards a dictatorship. And again, there are many Americans who are happy. There are always many people in any country who are unhappy. And Mr. Trump's supporters tend to be unhappy, not solely with the political policies of the last 50 years, which they feel have deprived them of economic progress, have left them with importance and with less significance in America than they would like to have. These individuals are also, some of them, a lot of them, feel that it's not simply the leaders who are failing them, but it's the whole political system. And they are more supportive of Mr. Trump, and they're more supportive of changes that would infringe on the Constitution. Looking back at history, I can see many times in American history where the situation is even worse than it is today, in terms of the American public being divided, in terms of Americans being angry, in terms of Americans feeling that the political system and the Constitution isn't working. So my response would be, I sleep comfortably at night. I am not deeply concerned about the possibility of dictatorship. But it is something that we're all aware of. And again, if Mr. Trump is rejected in 2024, it will be largely because Americans are concerned about his dictatorial impulses.
Professor Rhodes, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de X. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și în reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!